Hello my friends and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we're continuing my updated ultimate guide to spells with the level 3 spells, which are game changers. These spells are so powerful that a lot of the early game is entirely centered around simply surviving until you get to start casting them, because so many of them win entire encounters on their own or turn previously deadly situations trivial, which makes them the biggest power spike available to a party throughout the entire game. Which of these spells to take and cast may be the single most important skill that you need as a Baldur's Gate 3 player. That's how big a difference they make. I've already gone over the rating system and definitions of the tiers in part 1, so we can just get right into it. But before I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Tarantula for the $10 donation, Gnawing Fetus for the $2, Wanda Husbando for the £25, and Rodrigo Angeleli and Hilko Timmer for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate the support. Alright, let's change the game. We're going to start with Animate Dead, which is a pretty complicated spell because its effect actually changes depending on what level you use to cast the spell, and even within those different effects at different spell levels, it also gives the player choices in how to use it, so it's very flexible, has a lot of different possible effects. At 3rd level, you can use it to summon either a skeleton, who's a ranged damage dealer, or a zombie, which is a kind of weak melee fighter. The skeleton does pretty solid damage, and it will do this over an entire adventuring day if you can keep it safe, so it's a pretty nice addition to the damage output of your party. The zombie is pretty weak as a fighter by itself, but when it hits an enemy, it inflicts them with zombie disease, which, if the enemy dies while infected, turns them into more zombies. The skeleton is always a good default choice for Animate Dead. It's just a little more damage for your party over the course of the adventuring day. It can absorb maybe one attack before dying, so you can use it if you're in a really bad situation to block a doorway or distract enemies. Having more turns and more bodies on the field is just always incredibly helpful, so summons are just always good. The zombie is a little more of a specialized tool. You're going to want to use it for encounters where there's lots of weak enemies, which in some early game encounters there are, and the zombie can just zombify an entire encounter and win it in a single cast of a spell because the zombie just turns everything into more zombies and then they just win the fight for you. If you cast a spell with a level 4 spell slot, you get either 3 skeletons or 3 zombies, and then with a level 5 spell slot, you can start summoning ghouls. A ghoul is a fairly weak fighter for a 5th level spell, but it has a chance of paralyzing enemies on each attack, so if it gets to hit enough, you'll get some pretty strong debuffs out of it. And you can also summon a flying ghoul, which is squishier even than the ghoul, but of course can fly. With a 6th level spell slot, you can summon 3 ghouls or 3 flying ghouls, so depending on which spell slot you use, you can get a fairly large army. It's also important to note that if you're a necromancer wizard, you get +1 summon at each level, so a 3rd level spell will give you 2 skeletons or zombies, and a 4th level will give you 4, and so on. So obviously this spell is significantly stronger if you're a necromancer wizard. Animate Dead is a very solid spell. Summons are always very strong, being able to just make your party significantly stronger for every encounter throughout an entire day is always a valuable use of a spell slot. And being able to get multiple summons from the same spell gives you a lot of optionality with how you position them around the field, how you use them in order to maximize their damage, or how you use them in order to prevent enemies from attacking your more valuable party members. The question, of course, is which of the many options that this spell gives you should you use? And I think that the answer for most characters is that you want to use the 4th level version of Animate Dead to summon 3 skeletons. This will just give you a decent amount of extra damage throughout the day. Now, the skeletons will miss a lot of attacks, but when they do hit, their damage stays pretty respectable even on into the end game. And there's lots of ways to give them advantage or give them guaranteed hits, and of course it's just free to take an attack with them every turn. It only costs you the spell at the beginning of the day, so even if they only hit some of the time, you're still getting a lot of value out of it. You will also often want to summon a zombie for specific encounters, especially in the very early game where you have encounters like the goblin camps or the spiders where there's a lot of weak enemies and you can zombify them all. Then you will end up with a very powerful army that just wins the encounter for you. Generally, I think you're going to want to avoid casting the ghouls with a 5th or 6th level spell slot. By that point, you have stronger summons available, so more valuable uses of the spell. Of course, if you're a very summon-focused party, you can do both, and obviously that's still a powerful use of Animate Dead, but for most characters in terms of resource conservation, a 4th level spell slot is usually going to be the way to go with this spell. There's one niche interaction also with the flying ghouls, where the Abyss Beckoners don't drive them mad, the gloves that give your summons damage resistance, but it's kind of hard to keep them in the aura, and they still die really fast anyways, so I don't find that to be a particularly powerful strategy, but it is kind of fun to play around with. But for most characters, you're going to use this for constant extra damage for your party by summoning some skeletons. I'm going to give Animate Dead A tier. It's very good in some encounters, and it's a nice little bonus for all of the other ones. It doesn't just solve the game by itself like a lot of S tier spells, but summons are always very powerful, and this is a good one. Next up, Beacon of Hope. You can tell I'm recording this over lunchtime. Yes, I made that joke a year ago. Yes, I think it's still funny. Beacon of Hope is a concentration-based buff spell. You cast it, it's a 30-foot radius, so it hits your whole party, and for 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration, they have advantage on wisdom saves and death saving throws, and any healing they receive, they get the maximum possible value from. So if you use Healing Word, normally heals them for a d4, with Beacon of Hope active, it just heals them for 4. The advantage on wisdom saves is okay. There's a lot of other ways to get that effect, but that's an effect you're reasonably happy to have in some fights. Advantage on death saves is useless. If an ally is on the ground, you don't want to rely on death saving throws. You want to get them back up with healing. The question is, how good is maximizing healing? Because the other two effects really are not worth a level 3 spell slot. And the answer is, it's pretty much not good at all. Let's look at the numbers. If you cast Cure Wounds on an ally, then, which is one of the healing spells with the highest variance, because it uses d8s instead of a lot of them which use d4s, then the ally will normally get 4.5 average healing, plus any modifiers that you might have. Beacon of Hope means that they get 8 total healing. So they've gained an average of 3.5 extra hit points from you spending a spell. The Beacon of Hope didn't do anything by itself. You had to combo it with another effect, and the amount that it increased that effect was extremely minimal. Most of the time when you're healing in Baldur's Gate, you don't actually care how much healing you're doing. You're doing it to get downed allies back up, to apply the buff on heal items, or to allow them to take one more hit, in which case you're going to be using a large healing effect, like one of the high-level healing potions, and in which case maximizing it will usually not turn it from 1 extra hit to 2 extra hits, regardless. Beacon of Hope is super expensive. You're spending a level 3 spell slot and your concentration, and doesn't do anything by itself. You have to combine it with another effect, and that other effect is healing, something you usually don't want to do as a primary strategy, because offensive abilities are usually what you're going to be wanting to spend your turns on. So spending your time, effort, and spell slots on casting this spell is typically going to be extremely counterproductive. D tier for Beacon of Hope. The numbers aren't just there to accomplish the thing that it's trying to do, and the thing that it's trying to do also isn't particularly good. Next up, Bestow Curse, which is one of the weirder spells in the game. It's a melee range, single target, concentration debuff spell, which is not an encouraging thing for a spell to be, and when you land it on an enemy, they have to make a wisdom saving throw or receive one of a large number of possible disadvantages. You can give them disadvantage on a saving throw of your choice, any one of the 6 abilities. You can give them disadvantage on saves on that ability for 10 turns. You can give them disadvantage on their attack rolls. You can make it so that they take extra damage from all of your attacks and spells, specifically attacks and spells from the spellcaster. They will take 1d8 extra necrotic damage from. So you can use it kind of like Hex, where you concentrate on it on a specific enemy, and then they'll take extra damage when you hit them, just like they would from Hex. Or finally, you can use it to lock down an enemy, where they have to make a wisdom save every single turn, or they skip their turn. They just lose the rest of that turn. Now, most of these modes we can safely ignore. Disadvantage on a saving throw is not worth a level 3 spell slot and all of the other things that this spell costs you. And disadvantage on attack rolls we can get from Blindness with no concentration a level earlier, or from Fog Cloud with no saving throw 2 levels earlier, so Bestow Curse is not useful for either of those modes. The damage mode is pretty good, especially on wizards with Scorching Ray, and the mode that causes enemies to skip a turn is very powerful if your save DC is high enough. Each turn they make a wisdom save or they have to skip their turn, which, if you have high save DCs, can cause them to just stay locked down for an entire fight. Even so, neither of those abilities would be particularly worth casting Bestow Curse for an action, where you have to actually get up into melee and then maybe lose concentration because you're in melee and so on. If it wasn't for one other key feature of the spell, which is that it is fairly unique among hostile spells in that it doesn't count as a hostile action and doesn't start combat. You can cast Bestow Curse on a neutral character before combats begin, and it will not begin the combat, so it effectively is action economy free. So you can set up the extra damage from your wizard Scorching Rays or the complete lockdown of an enemy with the Dread version of Bestow Curse without spending an action on it at all. That, of course, is very powerful. Anything that's free to do in combat or before combat starts is always going to be really strong. And another thing is that the Dread version of Bestow Curse, like a few other crowd control effects, doesn't count as crowd control for the purpose of most immunities to incapacitation. So you can even lock down a bunch of honor mode bosses with it without running into their crowd control immunities. You're never going to cast this spell once combat has already begun. There are definitely better options that are both safer and more powerful and easier to use, but it's very powerful in some encounters which are against enemies that are neutral until you attack them or until you enter dialogue with them, because you can use Bestow Curse on those characters to get a massive advantage before the fight starts. I'm going to give it B tier because it's only useful in a fairly small subset of dangerous fights, but the fights that it is useful in, it's very strong in. Next up, Blinding Smite. Blinding Smite is a Paladin Smite spell, and because it's a level 3 Paladin spell, you don't get it until character level 9, so you're mostly only using this spell in the late game if you're casting it at all. Blinding Smite is a bonus action in addition to your weapon attack. It's made as part of a weapon attack, and it does 3d8 radiant damage. So compared to using just a normal Divine Smite with a level 3 spell slot, you're losing 1d8 damage, which is a relevant amount of damage to lose, but not the end of the world. And in exchange for that, enemies hit have to make a Constitution save or become blinded. Unlike a lot of the other special Paladin Smites, this one doesn't take your concentration, but enemies do get a new Constitution save every turn in order to break out of the blind. There are definitely fights where giving up a d8 of radiant damage in order to blind an enemy is valuable. Any fight that's going to go long, Blinding Smite can be a useful way to spend your action. Obviously, it is going to reduce the amount of damage that you're doing compared to using the spell slot, but just like the other smites, you can use it on top of a normal Divine Smite. So you can do, if you have 2 third level spell slots, you can use a normal Divine Smite and a Blinding Smite to do comparable burst damage to double smiting and do it all in one turn, and then also have a chance of blinding an enemy. The fact that it adds extra possible burst damage and it's radiant damage, which of course is a relevant damage type for paladins, and has a decent debuff attached to it, means that Blinding Smite is a great option if you just really want an enemy dead, or if you know that a fight is going to go long and having the debuff is worth more than the extra d8 of damage. You probably won't use the spell that often, but it's a nice one to have in your back pocket for when you want the extra burst damage or the blind. I'm going to give it B tier. Next up, Blink. Blink is a self-cast defensive buff spell. It doesn't take your concentration, but importantly, it can only be cast while actively in combat, so you do have to spend a real combat action on casting Blink. Each turn for the next 10 turns, you have a 50% chance of leaving the world. You go to the ethereal plane where you can't take reactions and enemies can't see, target, or injure you in any way, so you're completely invincible. And then at the beginning of your next turn, you will reappear in the material plane and be able to take your turn as normal. A 50% chance of becoming invincible does sound pretty good, but there's a couple reasons that this isn't as good as it sounds. Firstly, it's only a 50% chance, and when you're spending an action on a purely defensive effect, you really want to be able to rely on that effect, and Blink is inherently unreliable because you don't know if you're going to get Blunk. You can't plan your turns around it, because, again, there's only a 50% chance of it happening, and if you really need to skip a dangerous enemy turn, 50% of the time, but really more like 98% of the time, you're not going to blink, and you're just going to eat the full wrath of enemy attacks. The other problem is that the way that this works is by simply removing the character from the fight, so it prevents your reactions, which is already a real downside, and enemies who can't target this character, the damage doesn't just disappear, they're just going to attack the rest of your party members instead. So while there are situations where Blink can prevent actual damage from happening to your party, for the most part it's just going to retarget enemy aggro onto your party members, but not reduce the overall damage that you're taking. That can be a valuable thing to do, but it's much more efficient to do it with Mirror Image, which is a lower level spell slot and doesn't cost you an action in actual combat. So Blink is just not going to be used by most characters when you're playing in a party. There is, however, one real use case for this spell, which is for solo play. A 50% chance of turning your entire party invincible is much more exciting than a 50% chance of turning only one character invincible. Solo characters don't have allies to redirect aggro to, so if they blink out, enemies are just going to skip their turn. For that reason, I'm going to give it C tier, because it's a pretty potent defensive option in solo play, where it just makes you immune to half of all enemy turns, even though it's completely useless in party play, and you shouldn't cast this spell if you have allies. Call Lightning. Call Lightning is a repeatable damage spell available to Druids, Storm Sorcerers, and Tempest Domain Clerics, as well as Pact of the Tome Warlocks. And it does 3d10 lightning damage in a 7-foot radius, with a dexterity saving throw for half. A 7-foot radius is reasonably large. You'll often be able to hit 2 enemies with it. You usually won't be able to hit 3. But 3d10 damage to 2 different enemies is a pretty decent use of an action. And because it's lightning damage, of course, you can double it with the wet condition. If you are a Tempest Cleric who gets this for free, you can maximize that damage to a guaranteed 30 damage per shot. I say per shot because Call Lightning also lets you concentrate on it for up to 10 turns, and then you can recast it using your action each of those turns for as long as you maintain concentration on the spell. So you cast Call Lightning, and then you just spend the rest of the encounter calling down more lightning and just turn yourself into a laser cannon. Call Lightning's damage individually isn't amazing, but in any fight that's going to go long or has tightly grouped enemies, this spell does a lot of damage, and it's a very efficient use of your spell slots because you only need to cast this one spell, and then you have a great action to take for the rest of the fight, unless you lose concentration. It also works very well, of course, with the classes that get access to it, who often want to be doing cold and wet synergy to double out the Call Lightning damage. And for a Tempest Cleric, maximizing the damage is incredibly valuable. Doing 30 guaranteed damage, or 15 on a successful save, to a couple enemies is really good just in terms of damage efficiency, and also lets you plan your turns really well, because you can guarantee kill certain enemies. Call Lightning also, like a lot of the other spells that let you reactivate it using an action, just requires that you have an action. So if you are hasted or have a potion of speed, you can repeatedly cast Call Lightning in the same turn. So you can cast this multiple times using your hasted actions and get even more value out of the spell if you have haste from a party member or are drinking potions of speed. Call Lightning is just a very efficient spell. Good damage, good range, good radius, lots of synergy with things you already want to be doing, and of course you can repeat it over longer combats to get tons of damage for a single spell slot. You won't usually cast this spell just for the initial damage from it. If you're trying to burst down an encounter, Call Lightning is not your go-to, but in any fight that's going to go a little longer, it's a very solid spell. A tier for Call Lightning. Conjure Barrage. Conjure Barrage is a ranger spell, and as a 3rd level ranger spell, you don't get it until character level 9. And it basically lets you make a weapon attack in the shape of a cone. So you cast the spell, and you do your normal weapon damage plus 2d8 additional damage of the same type in a 30-foot cone in front of you with a dexterity save for half. Now, there's a couple things that differentiate this from a couple other spells that work off of your weapon. It doesn't work like an actual weapon attack, so it won't apply most on-hit effects. It actually just works like a spell. So it won't apply most on-hit effects from your weapon. And enemies have a dexterity save for half, which is obviously significantly worse in most cases than just attacking their armor class. It also, unlike most other spells that uses your weapon, takes your whole action. It doesn't work with extra attacks, so you can't Conjure Barrage and then do another attack. You have to spend your whole turn on casting this spell. All of these things together mean that you're giving up one attack to potentially do less damage to every target, because they may well save for half, and that is not a good trade unless you hit a huge number of enemies in this cone, which is extremely unreliable, and it costs a level 3 spell slot, which of course you have other uses for. There's just no reason to cast this spell. The numbers simply don't work out on it. The opportunity cost is too high. Just make weapon attacks if you want to do damage as a ranger. D tier for Conjure Barrage. Next up, Counterspell. Counterspell is a defensive reaction that lets you stop a spell as it is being cast. A spell that you counter simply disappears. It has no effect on the game at all. Counterspell is an absurdly powerful spell. It's one of the best 5 or so spells in the entire game, because the ability to trade your reaction for an enemy's entire turn, and a very valuable resource, one of their high-level spell slots, means that you are under vastly less threat from powerful spells than you would be otherwise. An honor mode party with 1 or 2 counterspell casters is just in so much less danger than an honor mode party without one. I've talked a little bit about how good these level 3 spells are, and of course, at higher levels, there are other dangerous spells that you want to stop. Counterspell just makes you immune to those as long as you have spell slots to burn countering them, which, of course, makes the game enormously easier. A lot of the most threatening fights in the game are against spellcasters, and Counterspell is your solution to those fights. However, the spell is somewhat confusing. So while it's absurdly powerful, I think a lot of people underrate this because they try it and have it not work. The game doesn't explain very well how the spell actually works. So I'm going to take a minute to explain how Counterspell actually works and how it's used, so that you understand how to get maximum value out of this incredibly powerful effect. When an enemy tries to cast a spell, the game will pop up a reaction asking you if you want to try to counter it and what level spell slot you'd like to use to do so. Make sure, by the way, that you have this spell set to ask you when you want to use it, otherwise it's going to burn your reaction and your spell slots on countering stuff that you don't care about. When you do try to counter a spell, that spell is automatically countered if you use a spell slot of equal to or higher level than the spell that's being cast. So if you're trying to counter an enemy haste and you use a level 3 counter spell, it will always be countered. If you're trying to counter a wall of fire, you use a level 4 counter spell, it will always be countered. But if you use a lower level spell slot, then you have to make an ability check. That ability check is equal to the difficulty of that ability check is equal to the level of the spell being cast plus 10. So if you're trying to counter a level 5 spell, you have to roll a 15 or higher on a d20 plus your main spellcasting modifier. At time of recording, this is also bugged, and always uses your intelligence, whether or not you're a wizard. So for a sorcerer, trying to counter a high-level spell with a lower-level spell slot is going to be an exercise in frustration, because it's going to roll using your very low intelligence. What that means in practice, even for wizards, is that you almost always want to try to counter a spell using an appropriate level spell slot. If you're trying to counter a spell of level 4 or 5, use a level 4 or 5 spell slot to counter it, because you do not want to turn this incredibly reliable, powerful effect into a die roll that you then have to make. And it's hard to get additional bonuses to that die roll. There's very few ways to adjust it in game, so you won't be able to reliably counter spells with lower level spell slots. Counterspell is absurdly strong. Being able to turn your reaction into turning off the enemy's entire turn is just invaluable and incredibly powerful. It's one of the best action economy exchanges in the game, one of the best resource exchanges in the game, one of the best panic buttons in the game. An honor mode party without Counterspell is at a significant disadvantage to an honor mode party with Counterspell. You need a very good reason to play a composition that doesn't get access to this spell, because you are making the game significantly harder if you don't have Counterspell anywhere in your party. Usually I like to have at least 2 characters that can cast this in order to maximize the level of safety of an honor mode run. Counterspell is, of course, an S-tier spell. One other important thing to note is there are no scrolls of this spell in the game, so if you're a wizard, you have to actually learn it by leveling up. And any party should strive to have at least 1 and possibly more characters that can cast it. S-tier for Counterspell. Crusader's Mantle. Crusader's Mantle is a paladin buff spell. So like other paladin spells, they don't get it until level 9. And they concentrate on it for up to 10 turns, and it makes your whole party, or every creature within a 30-foot radius, do an extra 1d4 radiant damage with each of their weapon attacks for up to 10 turns, or as long as you maintain concentration on the spell. It only works on weapon attacks, so if you have a party that is not heavy on weapon attacks, then you probably won't want to use Crusader's Mantle. But it works on every creature, so if you have summons with weapons, like the Animate Dead skeleton archers, then they will benefit from the extra damage from Crusader's Mantle as well. So, while parties that are heavy on spellcasters or have a lot of monks and stuff like that may not benefit from Crusader's Mantle, parties with summons that attack with weapons will get a lot of extra benefits from this spell. Being a paladin spell, you have to compare it to just using a divine smite, and in terms of burst damage, which is what you mostly want from paladins, it comes out significantly behind in that aspect. Unless you have a lot of summons with weapon attacks, you're usually going to be better off not spending a 3rd level spell slot and your concentration on a small amount of damage on each of your weapon attacks, because you could just spend that 3rd level spell on smiting for way more upfront damage. However, for those parties that have a lot of summons with weapons, Crusader's Mantle can be a lot of damage, because when you multiply it over 10 or so creatures attacking, then the extra 1d4 radiant damage adds up really fast. Crusader's Mantle is also not just available to paladins alone. War Domain clerics get this, and they get it at level 5, of course, because they're clerics, so that's when they get 3rd level spells, which makes it much more usable for War Domain clerics throughout the game. Bards can also take this with magical secrets, though usually this is not going to be a high priority for picking up with magical secrets. You're going to grab Counterspell instead. Overall, this spell is very situational. Most parties are just going to have more efficient uses of their level 3 spell slots and their concentration, but for a party with a lot of summons that attack with weapons, Crusader's Mantle can be very efficient. I'm going to give it C tier, I think, because it's going to be only very specific types of parties that will use this spell, but it will be pretty strong if you are one of those types of parties. It's also worth noting that this spell you can get from a cloak that casts it once per short rest. That cloak is actually pretty good because you're not spending an extremely valuable resource like a 3rd level spell slot when you're casting it from an item. Daylight. Daylight is big light. It's like the light cantrip, where you cast it on an ally's weapon, and they will glow with bright light, though unlike the light cantrip, it glows with bright light for a 50-foot radius instead of the 25-foot radius of the cantrip. Daylight can also be cast on the ground to make a 50-foot radius sphere of bright light, so you can use it to light pretty much any combat encounter entirely, so if you need an area lit, Daylight will definitely get the job done. Of course, when you're comparing a big version of a cantrip to that cantrip, you have to take into account this costs a 3rd level spell slot, and the cantrip is free. So is doubling the radius really worth it? Of course, the answer is mostly no. If you need light in most circumstances in the game, the cantrip or other sources of light are going to be more than sufficient, and you don't need to spend actual long rest resources on casting this spell. However, there are a couple cases where you might want Daylight over light. If you really need to light an entire combat arena for whatever reason, maybe you have an archer who needs to be able to see at long range, daylight can be a good way to do that. And there are a few enemies, most notably in Act 3 vampires, who are vulnerable to specifically daylight. And so for some specific encounters in the game, having this spell can be extremely strong. Most enemies who care about being lit at all don't care about whether it's just normal dim light or bright light, but vampires specifically suffer when under the effects of daylight, so this spell can be very good for them. Because it works in some encounters, I'm going to give it C tier, but for the most part you're going to be happy just with other light sources and won't need to cast this spell. Elemental Weapon. Elemental Weapon is a weapon buff spell similar to Magic Weapon, except obviously a 3rd level spell instead of a 2nd level spell. It's available to Paladins, who of course don't get it until level 9, but as of patch 8, newly available to Hexblade Warlocks as well, who get this starting at level 3 and then also get to automatically, level 5, excuse me, and then also get to automatically upcast it as they continue to level up. When you cast this spell, you choose a weapon, so either the main weapon in a character's hand, or you can put the weapon on the ground and target the weapon directly. And it enchants it with a +1 to hit chance, and +1d4 elemental damage of your choice. So you can choose acid, cold, fire, lightning, or thunder damage, and it'll do an extra 1d4 damage on each of those attacks. In Baldur's Gate 3, there's a lot of synergies available for these elemental damage types, so they can be pretty powerful. Cold damage can be used to freeze water surfaces, and alongside the Snowburst ring can create an ice surface underneath every enemy that you attack, causing entire encounters to slip and fall over. Lightning or thunder damage can be used to trigger reverberation, so for characters using the reverberation items, this can be a pretty powerful way to make sure that you're applying that effect on every single attack. And of course, lightning and cold damage can be doubled with the wet condition. So usually you're going to want to use one of those 3 damage types when you cast Elemental Weapon. +1 to attack and +1d4 damage on all your attacks all day isn't a terrible use of your concentration and a level 3 spell slot, but for Paladins, this comes fairly late in the game, and again, has to be compared to just using that spell slot for Smite, so often they won't want to spend their spell slots on Elemental Weapon. However, because Hexblade Warlocks now get access to Elemental Weapon, and it gets upcast for an extra point of attack and an extra 1d4 damage when used with a 5th level spell slot. So when used at 3rd level, it just does +1 to attack roll +1d4 damage, but once you hit Warlock level 9, you get +2 to attack and +2d4 damage on all of your attacks. Elemental Weapon is actually very powerful for Hexblade Warlocks. You can cast it on yourself, and as a Hexblade, you're going to be making a lot of weapon attacks, but it especially shines when cast on an archer ally, who can apply all this damage at range, use Snowburst ring shenanigans, and so on, and that's a totally reasonable usage for your Hexblade Warlock's concentration and one of their spell slots, so if you have a party member who makes good use of this spell effect, it's very powerful. Elemental Weapon is somewhat duplicated by the existence of the Drakethroat Glaive, which lets you cast this once per long rest and doesn't take your concentration. And also with the version used by the Drakethroat Glaive, you can twin cast it with a sorcerer, so you can cast it on 2 different weapons, so there's a lot of other powerful things that you can do with the item version of this spell. But for Hexblade Warlocks in particular, Elemental Weapon is a totally reasonable thing to spend their spell on, and will increase your damage pretty dramatically. You will have other things that you want to concentrate on a lot of the time with Hexblade Warlocks, but for a more supporting version of the character, Elemental Weapon can be pretty strong. I'm going to give it B tier for Hexblade Warlocks in particular. Paladins will very rarely want to actually cast this spell. Fear. Fear is a concentration-based AoE control spell, and at 3rd level there's a few AoE control spells which can be used to just win encounters outright. Fear is one of them, and picking the right one for a given encounter is very important. These control spells are what let spellcasters just win whole encounters on their own. Fear in particular is a 30-foot cone where enemies have to make a wisdom save, and if they fail the save, they drop their weapon and become fearful for 2 turns. Now, the fearful condition can be a little bit confusing because in Baldur's Gate 3, fearful, frightened, terrified, unnerved, and feared are all different conditions. So knowing which one you're actually applying can be pretty confusing because there's a lot of synonyms for the same thing. But the fearful condition in particular forces enemies to run directly away from you and makes them unable to do anything else on their turn. So for 2 turns, they're going to spend their entire turn just running away from the caster. If they end their turn outside of line of sight of you, they get another save to break out of the effect. Otherwise, they're just stuck in the fearful state for 2 turns. So when you hit an enemy with this spell, they just can't do anything for the next 2 turns. Also, they've dropped their weapon and then run away from it. So against weapon attackers, they'll have to come back in order to pick it back up, or probably be pretty ineffective. Fearful, when used on melee enemies, just outright shuts them down, and since it's a cone, that's when you're mostly going to want to use this spell. You concentrate on Fearful for 2 turns against a melee enemy, and it just runs away from you for 2 turns while you attack it. And then it's 2 turns of movement away from its weapon if it has somehow survived. That is going to just win any fight against primarily melee enemies pretty easily. It's a wisdom save, so the types of enemies that you want to target with this spell will typically fail it pretty frequently, so this is just an extremely powerful control spell. The only downside of this spell is that it's a 30-foot cone, so enemies have to get a little bit close to your casters in order for you to make use of this, but it is the strongest of the control spells when you actually land it on enemies, so it can be very useful to have this prepared, because it's the best one to land if it's possible to land it given the targeting restrictions. I'm going to give Fearful A tier. You're going to be using these AoE disable spells a lot, but you're going to be choosing between them in different encounters, so Fear is going to come up a pretty frequent amount, and you're just going to shut down melee enemies with it whenever you cast it. Feign Death. Feign Death is a spell that lets you put an ally into a coma and make them resistant to damage. So you cast it on an ally, it's melee range, and for 10 turns, they become completely incapacitated and unable to act, but gain resistance to all incoming damage except for psychic damage. You can also remove it early by using the help action on an ally, otherwise it will just last for 10 turns and then they'll wake up normally. This spell is completely useless when cast on an ally. Obviously, you don't want to incapacitate your own allies. Damage resistance is certainly not worth taking them out of the fight, because what is the point of having a resistant character there if they're not contributing to the combat? There used to be some uses to Feign Death where you could cast it on NPC allies to stop them from running into the middle of groups of enemies, so you could keep them alive more easily. You could also use this to steal from Merchant by casting it on Merchants who were allied to you, and then stealing all their stuff and they wouldn't notice because they were unconscious. But as of, I think, patch 7, you can only cast this on party members now, which makes it a completely useless spell. D tier. Fireball. Fireball is, of course, a classic spell. It's when you want to blow something up. It is an AoE damage spell with 13-foot radius that does 8d6 fire damage for an average of 28 damage, with a dexterity saving throw for half. Now, the fact that it's 13 feet is a real mark against this spell in Baldur's Gate 3. In tabletop D&D, this spell has a 20-foot radius, meaning that you're much more likely to blow up an entire encounter. In Baldur's Gate 3, a 13-foot radius means you almost certainly will not catch an entire encounter in a fireball without somehow otherwise grouping them up. Fire damage is not a great damage type in Baldur's Gate 3. There's a lot of enemies that are resistant to it, and a dexterity save for half is fairly likely to have enemies succeed because enemies will typically tend to have good dexterity saving throws. Enemies also have higher health relative to the tabletop game, so 28 average damage is just less powerful by the time you get access to the spell than it is in tabletop. None of those downsides mean that Fireball isn't a good spell. It's still a very solid spell for killing lots of weak enemies, especially if you can group them up, either using the Black Hole Illithid power later on, or just finding ways to cause them to cluster around your allies. But if you're used to casting Fireball in tabletop and having it solve a lot of problems for you, it just isn't the same spell in Baldur's Gate 3. A pure damage spell that will often leave enemies alive. If they pass the save, they're only taking 14 damage, which is just not going to kill a lot of stuff, is only going to be usable in some fights, because you can really only get benefit from Fireball if enemies are fairly tightly clustered, and they're relatively weak, so they're likely to die. You can still definitely cast this spell when those things come up, but as a go-to strategy, this is going to be less powerful than damage that you can spread out across enemies who are further spread apart. I'm going to give Fireball B tier because it's still a very powerful amount of damage. Sometimes you just need a big burst of damage, and this is a good way to provide it, but it's significantly less powerful than it would be in tabletop D&D, and is just not going to be useful in every encounter. Next up, Gaseous Form. Gaseous Form is a long rest, concentration, I guess buff spell that lets you turn a character into a cloud of gas. You cast it on an ally, and they turn into mist, becoming unable to make attacks, cast spells, or interact with the world in most ways, permanently flying, gain resistance to all damage, and become tiny in size, which lets them go through like cracks and pipes in various locations. Gaseous Form is pretty powerful for exploring because it gives you everything that you want. It gives you permanent flight, it gives you the ability to pass through small holes, and so on. And if you do get caught by an enemy, you have resistance to damage so you can get out. You can also use it to do various things like pass through gratings and fences. Any door that's not solid, you can pass through while you're in gaseous form. You can use it to hover over a lake of lava and maybe make enemies chase in after you. So there's some pretty creative uses and interesting things that you can do with gaseous form when you actually cast the spell. I actually went into quite a lot of detail on all the cool things you can do in my potions tier list, because one of the best ways of getting this spell is by drinking a potion of gaseous form rather than actually casting the spell. The effects of gaseous form are pretty powerful. When you want an exploration tool, this is one of the best ones, but it's very expensive. Your concentration and a 3rd level spell slot means that you are spending a lot in order to do something that is useless in combat. Obviously, you don't want to have your character, similar to Feign Death, gaining resistance to damage is not useful if your character's not doing anything in combat. So, Gaseous Form is not really a combat spell, although there's a couple uses for it, like passing through a grating or going out over a lake of hazardous material like lava or something like that. But other than that, Gaseous Form is just not going to be used in combat, so it's a purely out-of-combat exploration spell. There's a couple sequences in the game where this is the best way to explore, and you might want to cast this as a spell and save your Gaseous Form potions for combat, because the potions are actually pretty good there. So for that reason, I'm going to give it C tier, but you're never using this to actually fight. You're just using it to explore areas, and for that usage, it can be okay in some circumstances throughout the game. Glyph of Warding. Glyph of Warding is an AoE damage and control spell. It's non-concentration, and you cast it on the ground, and it lasts until an enemy passes over it and triggers the effect. You can use one of 8 possible effects with Glyph of Warding, although 6 of them are just damage. So you can do Thunder, Lightning, Fire, Cold, or Acid damage, and it does 5d8 of each of these types of damage, or of whichever type of damage you chose. Or you can have it knock enemies 20 feet backwards, or you can have it put enemies to sleep. Each of these uses has a dexterity saving throw. If it's one of the damage uses, then they'll still take half damage if they pass the dex save. If it is the detonation or sleep version of the spell, then they will ignore the effect if they pass the dexterity saving throw. The trick with Glyph of Warding is that although it looks like it's supposed to be cast on the ground and you wait for enemies to walk over it, that's not how you actually use it in practice. If you cast it directly on top of an enemy, it will detonate immediately. So you can just use this basically the same as Fireball. It's 13-foot radius, just like Fireball. So if you just cast this on an enemy, you're doing comparable damage in a very similar radius with a lot of optionality. Compared to Fireball's 28 average damage, 5d8 damage from Glyph of Warding does 22.5 on average, so significantly less average damage, but because you can do lightning or cold damage, you can double it using the wet condition, meaning that often Glyph of Warding will do more damage than a Fireball if an enemy is wet, and also it can trigger a lot of other effects. If you cast this on a puddle of water on the ground, the cold damage will freeze it, so you can get an ice surface from Glyph of Warding, and so on. And of course, if enemies are resistant to a damage type, you have 6 possible damage types at your disposal, so unlike Fireball, where a fire-resistant enemy will have trouble, you'll have trouble using it against, Glyph of Warding will almost always be valuable. The real use of this spell, though, is for the sleep version, because it is a non-concentration AoE sleep. It doesn't have a hit point requirement like the actual sleep spell, and it's dexterity save based. So enemies that will often pass disables against other kinds of disables, like enemies with good wisdom saves, so they might save against fear, may have poor dexterity saves and be unable to save against Glyph of Warding. The sheer versatility and power of this spell, it's one of the best AoE damage spells available at this range, it's one of the best control spells available at this range, and it's not concentration, so you can spam it during combats, makes this an extremely powerful option. There's some other things that make it even better for certain types of characters. For an Abjuration Wizard, this is an Abjuration spell, so casting it will also give you 3 Arcane Ward stacks whenever you use Glyph of Warding. So for Abjuration Wizards in particular, this is especially powerful. It's also Bard's best option for direct damage, so Bards in particular are going to be using this spell constantly. Clerics will also be usually concentrating on another spell like Spirit Guardians, and Glyph of Warding will be their best non-concentration way to add damage to that. This spell does everything. It's kind of the Swiss Army knife of spells, and it does each individual thing better than a lot of the spells that are specifically designed for that thing. S tier for Glyph of Warding. It's just so versatile and so powerful. Once you learn that you can cast it directly on an enemy, I think that's what keeps a lot of people from using it, is that it doesn't seem like it is used the same way as a fireball, but you can just do that, and when you do, it's going to be better in a lot of cases than the spells that do even one of the 8 effects that this spell does. Grant Flight. Grant Flight was renamed from the tabletop version of the spell, which is simply called Fly, to disambiguate it from other things called Fly in Baldur's Gate 3. It's a buff spell, and it lets you fly. Except it actually doesn't, because there's no such thing as flying in Baldur's Gate 3. You cast Grant Flight on a creature, and it's a 10-turn concentration buff. And while they have it, they can effectively do little hops using their fly action. It lets them, gives them essentially a 60-foot jump that uses their movement speed. You use 1 foot of movement speed to do 2 feet of flying. So you can split this up across multiple little hops, but you always have to land at the end of your movement. Unlike a jump, it can also go around corners and change direction in the middle and everything. So you are more mobile than you are simply by jumping, but a lot of the time you can just duplicate the effects of flight by using Enhanced Leap and just jumping to where you need to go. This can be useful for some encounters where you need a character to be particularly mobile. Maybe you have a melee character that needs to move from one side of an arena to the other frequently for whatever reason. Maybe enemies are spread out and all on top of high ground, like they're all on inaccessible pillars spread out around the arena and you need to move from one to the other. Grant Flight can be useful for those specific scenarios, but for most cases, where you just need to get somewhere in a hurry, being able to just jump there is more than good enough, and you don't actually need to fly. For the cases where you do need Grant Flight, potions and scrolls of this spell exist, so I think it's pretty rare that you're actually going to want to spend a spell slot on this spell, because just drinking a potion of Grant Flight will give you the same effect without wasting a 3rd level spell slot and the concentration of a character who might want to concentrate on an offensive spell instead. If this spell let you actually fly, then it would be extremely powerful, because it could keep you away from melee enemies and stuff permanently. As is, it really does not do that much that isn't duplicated by just jumping or running around. And it costs you a very expensive resource in order to do it. Misty Step will usually be more than sufficient for the mobility that you need as well, because it's rare that you need to teleport more than once in an encounter, so Misty Step will often just be good enough alongside normal jumping and normal character movement. So actually casting Grant Flight is rarely, I think, going to be correct. And, of course, when you do want it, you should just drink a potion of this spell. D tier for Grant Flight, not because the effect is necessarily bad, but just because it's so expensive and so easily duplicated by other things that spending your concentration and an actual spell slot on this is not usually going to be a good idea. Alright, my friends, that is 17 of the 34 3rd level spells, so we're halfway through, and this video is approaching an hour, so we're going to make the cut here. I hope that you have enjoyed looking at the 3rd level spells so far. Again, this list is shaping up to be very different from my previous version of the 3rd level spells list, with a lot of spells moving to higher tiers, which I think is really interesting. it's kind of neat that just as I have played the game more and gotten more experienced, spells that I had previously dismissed move up my rankings as I learn how to use them, and hopefully this spell tier list will give you some ideas for using spells that you had previously discounted. Of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. It helps me out a ton with the algorithm. And of course, if you think that there is anything that I should move to a different tier, especially if there are spells you think I'm underrating, definitely let me know in the comments. We've already moved some spells around, so I'm very open to continuing to do that. As always, you can subscribe to my channel for part 2 of this video, more Baldur's Gate 3 build guides, and other strategy game analysis. Thank you for watching, my friends, and I'll catch you next time.